Wearing dress whites was the only time Flora truly minded her burn scar, as the stiff collar relentlessly soared against the jagged keloid on her jaw. Across the ballroom, 3 men in tailored suits snickered and pointed a scotch glass her way, seeing only a deformed grunt and entirely unaware they were laughing at a ghost. The ballroom at Coronado smelled of floor wax, expensive sandalwood cologne, and the sharp, metallic tang of too much polished brass. It was a joint task force gala, a mandatory breathing exercise for politicians, upper echelon brass, and the private defense contractors who fed off both. Flora stood near a towering ice sculpture of a bald eagle that was already beginning to weep into a silver drip pan. She held a crystal champagne flute between her thumb and index finger. She didn't drink from it. The glass felt impossibly fragile against pads of skin that had been turned into thick, unyielding leather by years of nylon ropes, rusted rifle grips, and coarse desert dirt. She hated this. She hated the noise. The room hummed with a low, vibrating frequency of overlapping conversations, a white noise that her brain kept trying to dissect for threat indicators. Someone dropping a salad fork sounded like a firing pin locking into place. The sudden pop of a wine cork 3 tables over made her diaphragm tighten, a deeply ingrained biological flinch that she had to manually override with a slow, measured exhale. Her dress whites were immaculate, suffocating, and felt entirely like a costume. The uniform was tailored, but it couldn't hide the rigid, uneven geometry of her shoulders, one of which sat slightly lower than the other after a bad static line jump over the Hindu Kush. But it was the collar that was the real torture device. It rubbed against the massive, twisting scar that began just below her left ear, tore violently across her jawline, and disappeared down into the fabric of her shirt. The scar was pink, slick, and shiny under the terrible chandelier lighting. It looked like melted plastic. On humid days, it ached with a dull, throbbing phantom pain. Today, it just itched. It was a souvenir from a breached compound in Yemen, born from a homemade explosive packed with rusted corrugated tin and ball bearings. She didn't remember the pain of the blast. She only remembered the smell of ozone, the sudden taste of copper pennies in her mouth, and the unsettling silence that followed when her eardrums blew out. She shifted her weight, feeling her right knee give its familiar, sickening little click. She wasn't a superhero. She was 34 years old, and her body was a ledger of violent transactions, written in torn cartilage, microfractures, and grafted skin. I'm telling you, the logistics contract in Dubai is where the actual war is won. A voice drifted over. Flora didn't turn her head, but her eyes tracked the movement in the reflection of the dark window panel beside her. 3 men. Private military contractors, judging by the haircuts that were just a little too long for active duty and the suits that cost more than her annual base pay. They were ex-military, probably the kind who did 4 years in a supply battalion or walked patrols in a relatively quiet sector before cashing in on a security clearance and a gym membership. They were big, broad-shouldered, and radiated the kind of arrogant ease that only comes from never having been truly, profoundly hunted. She recognized the type. They thrived in these rooms. They spoke the language of synergy, kinetic assets, and force projection, while eating bacon-wrapped scallops. They were the men who sold the war. She was the one who actually had to bleed in it. She took a slow sip of the champagne. It tasted like battery acid. She wanted a cigarette. She had quit 5 years ago, right around the time she had to learn how to swallow solid food again without choking, but the craving never really vanished. It just went dormant, waiting for moments like this, moments where she felt entirely alienated from the human race she was allegedly paid to protect. The gold trident, pinned above her left breast pocket, felt heavier than a 60-pound rucksack. She knew the stares it drew. A woman wearing the Budweiser. It was a statistical anomaly, a political talking point to the suits, and an outright provocation to some of the old guard. She didn't care about the history of it. She didn't care about the glass ceiling. She just wanted to go back to her off-base motel, peel off the damp uniform, take 2 ibuprofen, and watch the static on a muted television. The 3 men were migrating toward the bar, closing the distance to her corner. The tallest one, a guy with a jawline like an anvil and eyes that looked entirely too pleased with the world, was holding court. "So I told the Sheikh's guy," the tall one was saying, loudly enough to ensure anyone within 10 feet was forced to be an audience. "You want premium perimeter security, you pay premium. We don't deploy mall cops." His 2 companions chuckled. It was a sycophantic sound. Flora stared straight ahead, keeping her breathing shallow and rhythmic. "Just blend in," she told herself. "Be the furniture. Give it 20 minutes, then slip out the side door near the kitchens." But the tall one shifted his weight to let a waiter pass, and as he stepped back, the heel of his polished Italian loafer caught the edge of Flora's dress shoe. He stumbled, his elbow jerking backward, sending a splash of amber liquid from his glass directly onto the pristine white sleeve of Flora's uniform. Flora didn't flinch. She just looked down at the dark, spreading stain on her sleeve. It smelled heavily of cheap bourbon and melted ice. The tall man, his name tag read, "Brody, Apex Defense Solutions," turned around, wiping his sleeve defensively. "Jesus, watch your..." His voice hitched as he actually looked at her. His eyes darted from the gold pin on her chest up to her face. He stopped at the scar. It was impossible not to. In the harsh overhead light, the deep ravines of the burn tissue looked angry and raw, pulling the left corner of her mouth into a perpetual, slight grimace. Brody blinked, recovering his composure with practiced, oily speed. The initial surprise morphed instantly into a condescending smirk. He looked at his 2 buddies, Hayes and Carmichael, who had crowded in behind him, drinks in hand. "Well," Brody drawled, his voice thick with unearned confidence, "guess I owe you some club soda, sailor. Didn't see you standing there." "It's fine," Flora said. Her voice was raspy, a permanent side effect of the emergency tracheotomy they'd performed in the dirt outside of Sana'a. She didn't look at him. She just pulled a cocktail napkin from the bar and dabbed uselessly at the bourbon stain. Carmichael, a stocky man with a neck thicker than his head, leaned in. His eyes raked over her, stopping dead on the trident. A muscle feathered in his jaw. It was the look of a man who felt his entire worldview was being personally insulted by her existence. "Rough night in the motor pool, Chief?" Carmichael asked, his tone dripping with weaponized casualness. He nodded toward her jaw. "Slipped wrench? Or did you just piss off the wrong mechanic over a hand of poker?" Brody laughed. It was a wet, guttural sound that rattled around in the back of his throat. To Flora, that laugh sounded exactly like the bubbling wet lung sound her spotter had made right before he bled out in her arms 3 years ago. The association was involuntary, a cruel trick of a brain permanently wired for trauma. Her heart rate spiked thump-thump, thump-thump, but her exterior remained entirely motionless. She didn't puff up her chest. She didn't deliver a witty, devastating comeback. She was just deeply, bone-achingly tired. "Something like that," Flora muttered, tossing the damp napkin onto the bar. She turned her body slightly, a clear dismissal, signaling she was done with the interaction. But men like Brody didn't handle dismissal well. It offended their fragile ecosystem. He took a half-step forward, invading her personal space. The smell of his cologne was overpowering, masking the stale scent of gin on his breath. "I'm just saying," Brody continued, his voice dropping a register into something he probably thought sounded intimidating. "It's a bold look for a gala. You'd think they'd have you working a desk where you don't scare the brass. Must be an inclusion initiative thing, right? Handing out tridents for admin work now?" Hayes snickered into his glass. Flora finally looked up. She looked directly into Brody's eyes. She didn't glare. Her expression was utterly flat, devoid of anger, fear, or annoyance. It was the dead, hollow stare of someone who had watched human beings turn into mist and chunks of meat on a Tuesday morning and then eaten a lukewarm MRE an hour later. Brody's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. There was something in her eyes that his primal lizard brain recognized as highly dangerous, even if his ego hadn't caught up yet. Her left hand, resting on the edge of the bar, was completely relaxed. She wasn't clenching her fists, she was entirely loose. I could shatter his kneecap with a downward kick. Her brain calculated with cold, detached efficiency. Drive the base of the champagne flute into the carotid. Use Hayes as a meat shield against Carmichael. She blinked, breaking the violent algorithm. No. Stop. If you'll excuse me, Flora said, her raspy voice barely rising above the hum of the room. She turned to walk away. Hey, don't walk away when I'm talking to, Brody started, reaching a hand out to grab her shoulder. He never made contact. The atmosphere in the room suddenly shifted, like the cabin pressure dropping in an aircraft. The low murmur of 100 conversations died out in a rapid, cascading wave of silence, starting from the grand double doors and rippling across the ballroom floor. Flora paused. Brody froze, his hands suspended in midair. Approaching them was a man who moved like a battleship navigating a narrow canal. General Thomas Reed, commander of United States Special Operations Command. He wore 4 stars on his shoulders, but he didn't need them for people to know who he was. Reed had a face carved from granite and eyes the color of a winter ocean. He was one of the few men in the building who had actually ordered men to their deaths, and the weight of it was visible in the permanent, harsh lines bracketing his mouth. The crowd parted for him instinctively. Brody immediately dropped his hand, his chest puffing out, spine snapping straight. He plastered on a look of profound respect, ready to be acknowledged, ready to engage in the high-level banter he believed he was entitled to. Reed didn't even look at Brody. He didn't look at Hayes or Carmichael. To the general, they were entirely invisible background radiation in a room full of noise. Reed stopped directly in front of Flora. He stood tall, but there was a subtle softening in his posture, a microscopic drop of the shoulders that only another operator would recognize as an expression of profound relief. He looked at the bourbon stain on her sleeve. He looked at the jagged, shining scar on her jaw. He looked into her flat, dead eyes. "You look absolutely miserable," General Reed said, his gravelly voice echoing slightly in the sudden, deafening quiet of the corner. "Just contemplating a tactical retreat to the parking lot, sir," Flora replied softly, the rasp in her throat catching slightly. Reed let out a short, dry exhale that was the closest he ever came to a laugh. "Stand your ground. We have the briefing at 0400. I need you sober and mean." Brody, unable to handle being ignored, leaned in with a wide, ingratiating smile. "General Reed, sir. Brody, Apex Defense. We met in." "Shut your mouth," Reed said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even turn his head to look at Brody. The words just fell out of him with the casual, crushing weight of absolute authority. Brody snapped his mouth shut, his face suddenly draining of color. Reed reached out and placed a heavy, calloused hand gently on Flora's uninjured shoulder. It was a gesture of immense, unspoken respect. "Good to see you back on your feet," General Reed said, his voice carrying clearly into the silence. "Evening, Revenant." Behind her, Flora heard the sharp, sudden intake of breath from Carmichael. Revenant. It wasn't just a call sign. In the dark, whispered corners of the defense world, in the classified after-action reports, heavily redacted in black ink, Revenant wasn't a person. It was an event. It was the ghost that had held the mountain pass in Tora Bora for 3 days with a shattered femur. It was the shadow that had systematically dismantled a cartel safe house in Juarez with nothing but a combat knife and thermal optics, leaving no survivors and no trace. Revenant was the bogeyman that SEALs told stories about when they were drunk and feeling mortal. Flora didn't smile. She just gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Sir." She finally turned around to look at the 3 contractors. Brody looked like he had just swallowed glass. His eyes were wide, fixated on her face, but he was no longer looking at the scar as a deformity. He was looking at it as a map of violence he could not begin to comprehend. His hands were trembling slightly against his suit trousers. Hayes took a very slow, very deliberate step backward, putting distance between himself and the woman he had just been laughing at. Flora looked at Brody's pale, terrified face. The urge to break his knee was completely gone. In its place was just a deep, hollow exhaustion. They were tourists. She was a native. There was nothing left to say. She turned her back on them, leaving the contractors frozen in the silence, and walked out toward the humid night air. The parking lot outside the hotel smelled of hot asphalt, dead seagull, and the faint, sweet exhaust of idling limousines. Flora walked past a row of them, her dress shoes clicking a steady, even rhythm against the pavement. The humid Pacific air immediately began to dismantle the rigid starch of her uniform, sticking the cotton to the sweat on her lower back. She didn't look back at the glass doors of the ballroom. The encounter with the contractors was already filing itself away in a mental cabinet labeled irrelevant. Brody's pale face, the sudden silence, the heavy hand of General Reed, it was just noise. Her rental car was a gray sedan parked under a flickering sodium lamp. It was utterly nondescript, the kind of vehicle that evaporated from memory the moment you looked away from it. She unlocked it manually, slid into the driver's seat, and slammed the door. The silence inside the cabin was immediate and absolute. Flora rested her forehead against the cheap vinyl of the steering wheel. She stayed like that for 2 full minutes. She didn't cry. She didn't sigh. She just let the engine of her nervous system idle down from the low-grade hum of adrenaline that crowded rooms always triggered. Her right hand moved instinctively to her jaw, her thumb tracing the hard, ropey edge of the scar tissue. It was radiating a dull heat. She started the car, threw it into drive, and pulled out onto the coastal highway. Her motel was 3 miles off base, sandwiched between a discount tire center and a liquor store with barred windows. The neon sign over the office flashed a garish, buzzing red vacancy, with the sea burned out. Flora let herself into room 114. The air inside was stale, smelling of old carpet cleaner and ozone from the humming mini-fridge. It was perfect. It was a space completely devoid of expectations. She walked straight to the small, laminate-topped table in the corner and began the meticulous process of shedding the skin she'd worn to the gala. She unpinned the trident first. The gold metal felt unnaturally heavy in her palm. She set it down on the table. It landed with a dull clink. Next came the ribbon rack, the warfare pins, the brass collar devices. She arranged them all in a neat, mathematically precise line. She stripped off the white jacket, then the shirt, dropping them over the back of a cheap vinyl chair. Standing in just her undershirt and uniform trousers, Flora walked into the cramped bathroom and turned on the harsh overhead vanity light. She braced both hands on the edge of the sink and looked at the mirror. The woman looking back at her was a stranger she only vaguely recognized. Her hair, cut ruthlessly short to fit under helmets, was plastered to her forehead with sweat. Her eyes, pale and bloodshot, were sunk deep into dark, bruised sockets. And then there was the map of her career, written in ruined flesh. The burn on her jaw was the loudest, but it wasn't alone. Peeking out from the neckline of her undershirt was the pale, puckered starburst of a gunshot wound she'd caught in Fallujah during her second deployment. A long, surgical zipper ran down her right collarbone where a metal plate held the bone together. Revenant. The name tasted like ash in her mouth. She hated the call sign. She hated the myth it had spawned. The guys in the teams talked about Revenant like she was a phantom, an immortal instrument of violence that felt no pain and required no sleep. They told the story of Tora Bora, how she'd held an elevated position for 72 hours, calling in broken arrow airstrikes while bleeding out from a shattered femur. They thought it was a story of superhuman endurance. They didn't know the truth. The truth was, up on that ridge, she hadn't been fearless. She had been a terrified 26-year-old kid shivering uncontrollably in her own urine and blood, begging a silent sky for it to just end. The only reason she kept shooting was that the physical mechanics of pulling the trigger distracted her from the agonizing, blinding pain in her leg. There was no glory in it. It was just the ugly, desperate arithmetic of survival. You either pull the trigger, or you become meat in the dirt. She turned on the cold water, cupped her hands, and splashed her face. The chill shocked her system, grounding her back in the cramped motel bathroom. Flora dried her face with a thin, scratchy towel. She walked back out to the main room and pulled a heavy black duffel bag from under the bed. The zipper gave a loud, satisfying rasp. Inside was the real uniform. She pulled out her plate carrier, dropping it onto the bed. It smelled of sweat, canvas, and the distinct oily scent of Hoppe's No. 9 solvent. To Flora, it smelled like gravity. It pulled her back down to earth. She spent the next hour working in absolute silence. She checked the ceramic plates for hairline fractures. She inspected the stitching on her magazine pouches. She stripped her sidearm, a battered Sig Sauer P226, wiping down the slide and barrel with a rag before applying a fresh, impossibly thin layer of oil. The metallic snick-clack of reassembling the weapon was a soothing rhythm, a mantra she had memorized through 1,000 repetitions. When the gear was prepped, stacked neatly at the foot of the bed, she looked at the digital clock on the nightstand. 1:15. She had 2 hours before she needed to leave for the briefing. Flora lay back on the thin mattress, keeping her clothes on. She stared at the water stains on the ceiling, illuminated by the blinking red light of the neon sign outside, bleeding through the cheap curtains. She closed her eyes. She didn't sleep. She just waited for the alarm, her breathing slowing down to a shallow, predatory rhythm. The briefing room at 0400 was a sensory assault. Fluorescent tube lights buzzed angrily overhead, casting a harsh, shadowless glare over the scuffed linoleum floor. The air was hyper-conditioned, freezing cold, and smelled sharply of stale black coffee and dry erase markers. Flora sat in the second row of metal folding chairs. She was wearing faded tactical pants, a black long-sleeve combat shirt, and worn hiking boots. The rigid, uncomfortable ghost of the dress whites was completely gone. Here, in this freezing room, she finally fit. There were 12 other people in the room. 4 Intel analysts, pale, sleep-deprived kids in polo shirts who looked like they lived on energy drinks and anxiety. And 8 operators, her team. Miller sat to her left, methodically tearing a styrofoam coffee cup into microscopic pieces. Davis was in the front row, his head tilted back, eyes closed, appearing fast asleep, though Flora knew he was absorbing every sound in the room. O'Connor was chewing on a thumbnail, staring intensely at the blank projector screen. Nobody spoke. There was no banter. The air was thick with a specific, heavy tension that only existed in the hours before a direct-action mission. It was the feeling of a heavy steel door slowly swinging shut behind you. The door at the front of the room opened, and General Reed walked in. He had shed the dress uniform. He wore a simple, tactical fleece over fatigues. The granite face was harder now, stripped of the political neutrality he'd worn at the gala. He looked like a man carrying a very heavy stone. "Listen up," Reed said. His gravelly voice cut through the hum of the lights, demanding immediate, absolute attention. Davis opened his eyes. Miller stopped tearing the cup. An analyst tapped a keyboard, and the projector flared to life, casting a topographical map of a jagged, inhospitable mountain range onto the screen. 4 hours ago, a CIA paramilitary asset was compromised in the Badakhshan province near the Tajik border, Reed began, picking up a laser pointer. The little red dot danced over a steep ravine on the map. He was gathering intelligence on a splinter cell, moving weapons-grade drone components. They made him. He's currently pinned down in a cave system here, taking heavy fire. He's got 1 broken radio, a sidearm, and maybe 3 magazines. Reed turned to face the room. He didn't pace. He stood perfectly still, The terrain is inaccessible by conventional rotary-wing aircraft due to high-altitude winds and localized anti-air capabilities, Reed continued. We can't fly a QRF in. By the time a mechanized unit drives up that mountain, our guy will be a beheading video on the dark web. Flora stared at the topographical lines on the map. The contour intervals were incredibly tight. It was a sheer cliff face. So, we drop you in, Reed said. The analyst clicked to the next slide. It showed a flight path for a C-17. Halo insertion, Reed said. High altitude, low opening, 30,000 feet. You'll jump in the blind, navigate the wind shear, and put down on a plateau roughly 2 clicks from the target package. You'll hike in, breach the perimeter, recover the package, and exfil on foot to a secondary extraction point 5 miles east. Terrain is brutal. The element of surprise is your only armor. Flora felt the familiar, cold stone drop into her stomach. A blind halo jump into mountainous terrain at night, followed by a heavily opposed hostage rescue against an entrenched enemy, with a 5-mile foot exfil carrying dead weight. It wasn't a mission profile. It was a suicide pact. Enemy numbers? O'Connor asked, his voice flat. Unknown, the lead analyst squeaked, clearing his throat nervously. Thermal imaging suggests anywhere from 20 to 40 combatants in the immediate vicinity. 20 to 40, Miller muttered under his breath, tossing a piece of styrofoam onto the floor. Against 8. Good math. It's the only math we have, Reed said sharply. He looked directly at Flora. Revenant, you're taking point on the ground navigation. If you miss that plateau by 50 yards in the dark, you're dropping 3,000 feet into a gorge. Understood, Flora rasped. Questions? Reed asked, sweeping his eyes over the room. Nobody raised a hand. There was no point. The parameters were set, the variables were out of their control, and the only thing left to do was execute. Wheels up. In 45 minutes, Reed said. Godspeed. He turned and walked out of the room. The door clicked shut behind him. The analysts immediately began packing up their laptops, eager to escape the suffocating gravity of the operators. Flora stood up. Her knee gave that sickening little click. She ignored it. She walked down the long concrete hallway toward the armory. The air here smelled heavily of gun oil, ozone, and damp concrete. She thought briefly of Brody, the contractor in his tailored suit, holding his scotch glass and laughing about mall cops and logistics contracts. He thought war was a boardroom negotiation. He thought it was about projecting strength and counting profit margins. He didn't know anything about the cold. He didn't know about the terrifying silence of falling through the night sky at terminal velocity, waiting to pull a ripcord you prayed hadn't frozen. He didn't know about the smell of copper pennies, or the way a human body simply stops being a person and becomes an object when the metal hits it. Flora pushed open the heavy steel door of the armory cage. The quartermaster pushed a customized Mk-18 rifle across the rubber matting of the counter. She picked it up. The metal was freezing cold against her calloused hands. She ran her thumb over the selector switch, feeling the crisp, mechanical click as it moved from safe to semi-auto. She wasn't a myth. She wasn't a ghost. She was just a tired woman with a ruined face, standing in a basement, getting ready to do the terrible things that men in clean white shirts drew on dry erase boards. Flora slapped a loaded 30-round magazine into the well. She pulled the charging handle back and let it slam forward, chambering around with a sharp, heavy clack that echoed off the concrete walls. She slung the rifle over her shoulder and walked out toward the tarmac, disappearing into the dark.